With the 2024 WNBA season finally coming to a close, it's time to rank the game's top players. The criteria for this list may be different than what you're used to, but for the sake of this exercise, the question I'm looking to answer is, which player gives a randomly constructed team the best odds of winning a title? This is referred to as championship equity and is an idea I got from Thinking Basketball. The goal is to look at every player in a vacuum without any bias towards a player being in a floor-raising or ceiling-raising situation. Essentially, a player doesn't receive favoritism for carrying a bad team to the playoffs, nor does a player get boosted for playing on a championship-level team or winning a title, but rather I'm looking at the skills a player might possess that would improve the odds of a reasonably constructed team winning a title. This includes skills like efficient shot creation, passing, and playmaking, but also less noticeable traits like switchable defense, impenetrable rim protection, and off-ball values like cutting, rebounding, screening, and catch-and-shoot ability. I will be considering players in different contexts besides the one they're currently in. Some players are able to have their weaknesses hidden in their current system, maybe a weak defender that is hidden by versatile defensive teammates, or on offense, a struggling playmaker that has elite distributors playing next to them. While others have skill sets that aren't able to be showcased because their team's weaknesses drown out their strengths, like an elite scorer who lacks reliable outside shooters, or a shot blocker that lacks teammates with perimeter defense. All of this will be considered. And perhaps the most important thing to emphasize is that team record and media voted awards are entirely useless for the purpose of this discussion, as are accolades won in previous seasons. Rather than basing my opinion on wins and losses or what other people think, both of which are heavily dependent on other circumstances outside of a player's control, I'd rather form conclusions based on the film I've watched and the statistical metrics that I used, which I'll get into in a second. Because sample sizes in the WNBA are extremely small, I will emphasize ranges for where I can see a player being ranked. This will be based on optimistic or pessimistic evaluations of their skill sets relative to the other players and situations. Since there are only 40 regular season games and a handful of playoff games every year, I didn't consider players that didn't play a reasonable amount of games this year. Even if they'd be strong considerations for the top 10 in other seasons, if they didn't play enough, they weren't considered. There was no set number of required games to be considered, but it was a know it when you see it type of ordeal. Satu Sabally would have been in strong consideration for this list under normal circumstances, but she didn't play enough games this year, so she was not considered. The postseason ranges from 2 to 13 games depending on the team, which is not a strong enough sample to form conclusions about whether a player is a playoff riser or dropper. It's not normal for a player's struggles or successes to be magnified in moments like these, but for this list, I put more emphasis on the regular season while still contextualizing the playoff numbers and how they represent a player's overall value. As for the stats used in this series, I didn't use many traditional stats that you're probably used to seeing. Instead, I used stats that better contextualize a player's offensive value. Stats like points per possession instead of points per game, box creation instead of assists per game, offensive load instead of usage rate, total rebound percentage over rebounds per game, and most importantly, true shooting percentage as the measure of scoring efficiency instead of field goal percentage. I'll link all of these stats and videos that explain why I prefer them in the description box below. Defense is much harder to gauge with stats. Blocks, steals, and rebounds are probably the worst stats to judge a player's defensive performance, so film was mostly the basis for my evaluations on defense, but also for rim protectors, looking at how much they impacted shot attempts and field goal percentage at the rim are stats that I mostly inquired about. Synergy and Second Spectrum were also a huge help for finding how effective a player was in certain schemes. Essentially, I looked at stats that are specific to a player's role within the team's defense rather than basic counting stats that are absolutely useless in the vacuum of a top 10 list. I did take a look at some advanced stats like Raptor, LeBron, EC, and on-off data, but as I've mentioned all year, these stats typically need 1,500 to 1,800 minutes before they start to stabilize, a number most of the players on this list did not reach, so they weren't as strong of a basis for my analysis. Because of this, I looked at a player's advanced metrics over the span of multiple seasons, typically going back no more than 4 years, to get a better understanding of whether their 2024 value is more or less noisy or a trend. Now, some players have gotten substantially better or worse in a 4-year span, and some might have not even been in the league 4 years ago. Jackie Young wasn't even a full-time starter 4 years ago, and Caitlin Clark hadn't even played a game at Iowa yet. Because of this, my list will be based on speculation, how I think a player will perform in a different circumstance, as well as which version of a player is the best indicator of their actual overall value. Obviously, film will be the primary basis for my conclusions, but because speculation leaves room for interpretation, the ranges for which I see a player will be much larger than you may be used to seeing. Last but not least, understand that my list will probably not be the same as yours, which is perfectly fine. If we all had the same exact list, there would be nothing to discuss, and that would make basketball a lot less fun. Before I go, I want to make it clear that I considered at least 15 names for this ranking. They will be listed as honorable mentions in my next video, but I would say the best of the honorable mention group for me would be Ezi Magmagor, Kayla McBride, and Kalia Copper. Everyone else is fair game, and you'll have to wait until the finals ends to find out who my top 10 players are. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you when it's countdown time.